To call in, there's still time. There are those of you that are going through health issues, relationship issues, personal issues, spiritual issues, whatever your issue may be. We want you to dial that number and call into those that can help you as you overcome your challenges. But we're here today to talk about relationships and communication, because what we've discovered is that regardless of whatever your problem may be, you may have a sexual problem, you may think you have a financial problem, it may be a parenting, an in-law problem, whatever it may be, but at the core of it all, one of the biggest challenges is the fact that we fail to properly and effectively communicate through these issues. Right,
we've been hearing that word over and over again, communicate, because that is the foundation of your relationship. You cannot have true intimacy if you're unwilling to communicate and be open and transparent.
And the problem is, so many of us come from different households with different cultures, different patterns, and we come together, and oftentimes the way that we do things are completely opposite than the way that our partner does things, and we clash.
Absolutely.
And so oftentimes that causes the problem. And so when identifying some of the different types of personality types as it relates to communication, you have what is called the peacekeepers and the peacemakers. Now, what's interesting about the peacekeepers and the peacemakers, a peacekeeper is someone who loves to keep the peace, right? They just love to keep the peace. They don't like conflict. They don't want to get into an argument. They don't want to deal with those issues over and over again because they know where it's going to go. So they rather sweep it under the carpet, deal with it later, right? And so what happens is, if you're a peacekeeper, you're avoiding something that will ultimately become inevitable for you to deal with in a relationship.
Absolutely. I'm a peacekeeper. We worked on that, didn't we? Because what happens is you just don't want to get into a fight. You don't want to get into an argument. You don't want to, you know, make any problems. You just want to keep moving on and be smooth. And next thing you know, you tripping over that carpet and breaking your neck. Didn't we talk about that before?
Right.
So that's something that we need to really work through. Actually sitting down and taking each thing piece by piece, one at a time, and discussing those issues and getting them out there and dealt with.
And what's so deep is that individuals who are peacekeepers oftentimes emotionally shut down a lot of times, because that's a relational communication pattern that they may have learned, say, from their home. And so when it gets too tough, when it gets too violent, I don't mean physically violent, but when the conversation just looms on and on and on, we have a tendency to just emotionally shut down. And so rather than bringing conclusion and resolution to the matter, we end it.
We end it.
And so all of a sudden, those issues fester and grow, and we never get a chance to deal with it.
And it's really not fair to the other person, because you just ended it. You didn't want to deal with it. They've moved on. They're not the peacekeeper like you. They've forgotten about it. But you held on to it. You just didn't deal with it right now. It's like on the shelf in your reservoir. It's piling up with all the other stuff. And at some point, it's going to blow up on that person, and they're going to be like, where did this come from? I didn't know that you had these feelings. You never told me.
Yes, because they've held it inside for so long. And what's so interesting about it, when dealing with gender, generally speaking, a lot, not all, but we find that there are men that oftentimes keep things inside. They don't verbalize. They don't necessarily communicate their feelings and their emotions. But when they do speak, sometimes it comes out in a very violent and boisterous way. And we're finding that women follow in that same pattern as well. So that's something that you really need to work on. But then on the other side, you have what is called the peacemakers. And what's interesting about the peacemakers, these are individuals that want peace at all costs. And they will go to war to get the peace that they want. These are the individuals that'll have you up till 3 o'clock in the morning because we've got to deal with this issue right now. We've got to resolve this conflict. That used to be me. That used to be me. Because you were the peacekeeper, I was the peacemaker. And so the problem is, when both of you are operating in your extremes, it causes a problem. But when you learn to begin to move closer to the middle, and you begin to learn how to dance with one another in terms of dealing with these issues in its proper time, in its proper place, in its proper season, you can resolve a lot of that conflict.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. It's just like, you know, if you come closer together and God's at the top, you're under his shadow, and you're working together, you're trying to look and be more like him, and so now you start to work together through these issues, and you begin to change a little bit, and we begin to look alike and act alike, don't we?
Absolutely. And one of the other challenges I find is that, listen, men and women who have problems communicating, and if we had to put a title to this, it would be My Mouth is Killing My Marriage, because so many people are getting into trouble because they're speaking the wrong words from their mouth.
You cannot take it back. Once it's out there, it is said.
You know, they say that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, that is a lie. Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will kill you.
Yes, they will.
Words will do what sticks and stones cannot.
Yes.
And so that's why you have to be careful with the words that you speak. Even the Bible says that life and death are in the power of the tongue. So you can speak life to your situation, or you can speak death to your situation.
Wow.
And it's so deep because, Danielle, the scriptures even say that our mouth sometimes could be like open graves. And so we're killing our marriages, we're killing our relationships, we're killing the intimacy that we have with each other because of what we're saying.
And it builds up, and there's no apology that comes, and therefore there's no forgiveness that comes. Not that you need one to do the other, but you have these relationships where people are married to each other with unforgiveness, bitterness, no apologies, and you're operating in these dead relationships.
Yes. Yes, and what we find is that when we're dealing with women who struggle with these communication issues, usually they fall into one or two categories, right? They're called either makers of men or breakers of men.
I'm a maker.
Now, a maker of men, let me explain, is someone who knows how to edify, who knows how to build that man up, who knows how to encourage him, giving him the emotional support that he needs. Even if that man is not where he needs to be, she knows how to speak to the potential of that man and breathe life into him, right?
Yes, because every man on the inside of him has a seed, and you wives, it's your job to water that seed. That's why God created you, to be his helpmate, okay? So there's some soil in there you're supposed to be tilling. But if you pour in all kinds of garbage and trash onto that seed, you don't water, it's dry, you're going to kill that seed in that man. And now what you're saying, it's sort of like you're prophesying his future, because you have not spoke life to him, but you've spoke death to him. And you find a lot of men are just broken, right, in their relationships. They don't want to talk. She says does all the talking. She handles the money. She handles the everything. And he's just sitting there broken and quiet. He don't talk much. He don't say much. Isn't that something?
That's very, very true. So I encourage every woman to be a maker of your man and edify him and build him up, because when a man has a woman who supports him, who encourages him, he feels as if he can conquer the world. But if he doesn't have his woman on his side, it really affects him. And that's when we get into what we call the breakers of men. This is a woman who knows how to tear a man down with her words, and who knows how to say the right thing in the right way to really get to that man. Some men today are walking around impotent, nothing physically wrong, but the words that came out of her mouth were like daggers that cut into the heart of that man's ego and have just completely destroyed him. And there's so many men walking around today with no confidence, no self-worth, no value, because they've been told you're not a man. Because if you were a real man, right, that's the typical thing that we hear. If you were a real man. And so it's interesting how so many women know what a real man is, but we're still trying to figure it out. Because many of us came from households where we didn't have that example. Or if there was a man there, in most cases it wasn't always a good one.
That's so true.
So we're in a search for significance. We're still trying to find out who we are, and we don't need our wives, our women, the ones who are closest to us, beating us down. We need that encouragement and support.
Absolutely. And to defend the women, you know, a lot of us didn't grow up in homes where we saw our mothers, you know, pouring into her husband and treating a man the way that you're supposed to. And so we're trying to figure that out. We're trying to figure out our gender roles. So, you know, there's a lot of confusion going on within marriages, just not knowing what we should or shouldn't be doing.
Yes. Now, I will say this. Just as women have this issue, men have this issue as well. And there are so many women today. You know, we just had a guest on who was talking about domestic violence. But there's so many people who are in emotionally violent relationships, or what we call verbally violent relationships. And so many men have spoken to these women, so much so that they literally have no self-worth, no self-esteem. They feel trapped in their relationship. They feel as if they think about leaving this horrible relationship, their lives may be at risk. And so there's a whole lot of unhealthy interactions between men and women today.
It's absolutely true. I grew up in a home that was exactly like that. Total, no communication, violent. It was just a horrible scene. And I think a lot of us, unfortunately, are growing up in these environments, but we need to take responsibility as we get into our own relationships and learn the proper tools on what to do to operate in our relationships properly.
You know, the Bible says that men as husbands, we are to love our wives like Christ loved the church and gave his life for the church. And so if you truly love your wife, there's no way that you can communicate in the fashion that you do, because you're supposed to be speaking life into her, not death into her. So a lot of times what happens is when we speak negatively to our partners, we don't realize that we're actually closing their spirits, right? And so I can speak a word that affects you and walk away and not be bothered, but a day later I come back and you're still affected. I'm like, well, what's wrong with you? Well, it's the words that you spoke. You know, it was so interesting. I was on a television interview and I was dealing with a couple that were going through problems, and I gave the analogy and I said this: if I were to ball up my fist, I was talking to the gentleman, and if I were to punch you in the face and knock you down, that would be considered a physical wound. It may take 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks to overcome the pain that I caused by knocking you out. But if I verbally communicate something, right, that is stinging and painful, though you don't see the wound, it creates an emotional wound. And sometimes it could take 2 months to 2 years to get over it. So a lot of times, you know, if there were crimes for speaking negative words, there would be a whole lot of people in jail.
Oh my God, absolutely. And it's something that we're used to doing because we've seen it. We see it on TV, we see it in our homes, we see it with our friends. We don't realize the power of our word. The Bible tells us that our words have power. When we send a word out there, it goes out there and turns into things. So you can't think that you can spew all these curses and hate to your spouse, to your children. A lot of people have never had that understanding because they've experienced hatred come to them so often that they think there's nothing wrong with cussing out their children or calling them outside their name and things like that. And so this is something that is a critical issue within relationships that we need to turn around.
I think you just hit it right on the head. You know, a lot of times we come from households where we're constantly called names. We're called out of our name every other day. And a lot of times we get into our adult relationships and we call our partners by everything but their name.
Because it's normal.
Yeah, that's right. So rather than having what we call, you know, this pet name, they become negative names that really affect that person's self-worth, self-esteem, and the interaction that they have with one another. But to your point, you made a very good point. Where do we learn how to communicate from? We learn how to communicate from our homes. And there's something called a family marinade as it relates to our communication that you have to be mindful of. Share it with them.
Well, it's your environment. You think about if you were to take a piece of steak and get out on the grill, before you put that steak on the grill, you're going to put it in a nice marinade overnight. You're going to wrap it in foil and let the juices sink in nice and good. And then when you're ready the next day to put it on the grill, it has been saturated in the flavors from that marinade. And so in the same way, when you grow up in a household with certain dynamics, you're saturated in that dynamic, and the good and the bad. And so when you grow up and you become an adult and go into your own relationships, if you don't become aware and get the training that you need to remove all the baggage and the negative things, you're going to operate with your marinade. You're going to operate with all the things that have been put into you through your life growing up, those bad attitudes, the way that you talk to people, the lack of communication, all of that you're going to unfortunately pour onto your spouse.
And as we always say, children learn through observation and participation. It's not necessarily the lessons that you say, sit down, son, sit down, daughter, I'm going to give you a quick lesson.
Or don't do this, do that. They don't listen to that.
They look at what you do.
Exactly.
They emulate what you do because they're computers. So if you're speaking to your spouse with a negative tone or constantly calling your husband out of his name, then you're teaching your child how to communicate so that when they enter into adult relationships, they will take that same pain, that same hurt, that same bitterness, that same pattern into their relationships, and they'll wind up polluting the other person based upon what they've learned from their home.
Yes, absolutely. We overcame some of that, didn't we? Talk about what we've overcome.
Well, we struggled in the very beginning because we have different relationship styles or different communication styles. And so what happens is the way that you communicate represents, in essence, your own agenda and way of doing things. And conflict are when two agendas operate in the same space at the same time. And there's no type of opportunity for there to be harmony.
Yeah.
And so because I would say things that were just on my heart and didn't think about how I was saying what I was saying, it would negatively affect you.
Sure. And I think my level of sensitivity, I mean, whatever that is in my marinade that allowed me to be so sensitive to things would make whatever criticism or however you came at me even more heightened.
Yes.
So there's something that you have to do to come about a balance, you know, and there are tools. Thank God there are tools that you can learn how to operate in a relationship functionally and have happiness, be in love, have passion. Thank God.
Yes. And the thing is, you've got to get to the point where you realize that, you know what, if things are going to change in my relationship, I've got to look at me. Because I can't change her sensitivity.
Right.
That's something she has to work on. She can't change how I may be as, I don't know, honest and as raw. As I am. That's probably a good way of saying it. I was just raw, and I didn't think about how was it affecting her. And so when you get to the point where you realize that, you know what, at the end of the day, the lowest common denominator in every relationship you enter into is you, then that means that you look at yourself and make adjustments within yourself.
Major changes take place when you start looking at yourself, because now you've taken the focus off of your partner, because all this time you're going like this and you're focusing on your partner. You never really focus on yourself. Even when you could be sitting in a service listening to the church and the pastor said something and you think, hope husband heard that, and you're not even taking that word for yourself. You're not even receiving what the Lord might be trying to say to you. But it's not until you start to look at yourself and your own issues and just really working on you that things really can start to get better in your relationship, because now he's able to work on him without your nagging criticism, and you're not even focused on him. You're focused on empowering and bettering yourself.
That's right. So folks, listen, if you have been killing your marriage with your tongue, tame your tongue, right? You know, the scripture tells us that we need to think or actually listen twice as much as we speak, because you have two ears, right, and one mouth. So you should use it in that proportion, because when you don't think about what you say, if you just say things the way that the way it comes out at that time, you don't realize the damage you can be doing. So if you've killed your marriage, I want to let you know that you can speak life to your situation. Just as Jesus was resurrected from the dead, you have that same resurrection power within you. You have that same resurrection power in your tongue, and you can resurrect a dead marriage today, tonight, right now, this morning. You can do it. It is up to you, but you've got to take personal accountability over your own mouth and over your own style of communication. When we begin to do that, our relationships will begin to transform overnight.
Absolutely.
Isn't that powerful?
It's very powerful. It's what happened with us.
It happened with us, and if it can happen with us, and let me tell you folks, we went through, we were at a point where we just were ready to call it quits. There was nothing I could do that could warm her up and bring her back over, but it wasn't until I began to work on me that things began to change. So folks, listen, we are excited about what we're doing. We're excited about what's happening, and we just want you to know that if you come together with your partner, with your spouse, with your boyfriend, with your girlfriend, and begin to work on things, it will transform your relationship.
Yeah, you've got to be committed. You got to want this too. You know, it can't be just, well, he's not doing this and she's not doing that. Both of you need to come together and decide that you want this relationship, that it will work, and then begin to work on each other to make it happen. It's got to be, it's a two-way street.
I think what happens is in relationships, we're selfish. We want things our way. Well, you just have to accept me for who I am. Well, wait a minute. No, I don't. Because if you're crazy, you need to make some adjustments in your character, right? And I think that's what's causing the problem. And what happens is because we don't know how to apologize and we don't know how to forgive, it creates bitterness and resentment, and we carry it through from day to week to month to year, and then all of a sudden we're emotionally disconnected from one another and don't know why.
It's so true. That forgiveness, what you just said, is so key. Just being able to, when somebody approaches you and apologizes for whatever they did to offend you, letting it go. So many couples talk to us about how she just won't let it go. She keeps bringing it up. It was 7 years ago, and the same thing for the men. You've got to really commit to apologizing, lift it up to God, let him have it, and move on if you want to make things work out.
And you know what? It's funny because I interview couples all the time, and I counsel them, and a lot of people say, well, why don't they just let it go? Well, there's a process for letting things go. If you've hurt me and you've never changed course and changed your behavior, I just can't let it go. There's things that we both have to do to make that happen. So listen, folks, communicate, revive your marriage, take it to the next level. We're going to another wonderful selection, so stay right tuned for more wonderful music.